Welcome to Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast. My name is Stephanie Vlakis and I'm an expert certified fertility dietitian and nutritionist and founder of the Dietologist, a multiple award-winning virtual fertility and pregnancy nutrition clinic serving thousands from around the world, and of course, the host of this pod, Fertility Friendly Food. This podcast is dedicated to all things health and nutrition in the world of fertility, reproductive health, and pregnancy. Each week, I bring you practical snack-sized episodes to help improve your lifestyle on your trying to conceive journey, alongside guest expert interviews to help inspire you to learn and grow whilst you grow your family. Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fertility Friendly Food. And it is September again. I can hardly believe we are 3/4 of the way through the year. Time honestly truly does fly, but September is a super special month because it is PCOS Awareness Month. PCOS, or polycystic ovarian syndrome, affects almost 20% of females of reproductive age, and it is characterized by symptoms of irregular menstrual cycles, facial hair growth, acne, and polycystic appearing ovaries on ultrasound, amongst many more, like weight gain, uncontrollable hunger, higher risk of developing binge eating disorder, higher risk of developing gestational diabetes and type 2 diabetes thanks to insulin resistance, and much, much more. But it is not all doom and gloom. Diet and lifestyle is absolutely key in managing your PCOS, and you'll hear me talk about in this episode with Candice, who I'll introduce in just a second. But something I hear a lot from our clients who have been diagnosed with PCOS perhaps in their late adolescent years or early 20s, well before they were ready to start trying for a baby, is that they really wish they were referred to a dietitian like us who focuses on PCOS from the beginning. So please do not underestimate how valuable nutrition and lifestyle can be in managing the symptoms and the hormonal imbalances that underpin PCOS, whether you are trying to conceive or not. Now, without any further ado, let's introduce Candice Crellin, Accredited Practising Dietitian and Nutritionist and Team Senior Dietitian here at the Dietologist. Can hardly believe she's been with us for a year already, and PCOS is one of her special interest areas. She has a long background in helping people with PCOS in her previous roles in hospitals across Australia, and we are so lucky to have her incredible expertise and wisdom in this arena, as well as informing her practice is her interest in diabetes and insulin resistance as well, which is a key component of PCOS management in terms of the long-term health risks. So without any further ado, let's welcome Candice back to the podcast for the first installment of our PCOS mini-series this September. Welcome back to the podcast, Candice. How are you today?
Good, thank you. Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here again.
Absolutely love picking your brains, especially about this topic for our PCOS mini-series for the month of September. So today we are talking about frequently asked question that we get both online and offline in our one-on-one client sessions, which is, what is the best diet for PCOS? So if you know our ethos, we know that there's no single best gold standard anything because we're all individuals, but let's talk about some of the most frequently discussed dietary patterns when it comes to PCOS, particularly online. We see a lot of keto, a lot of low carb, we see intermittent fasting being the magic bullet. And then, of course, we've got the types of dietary patterns you often find people like us talking about, like the low GI and the Mediterranean diet. And another common one is, of course, the gluten-free, dairy-free miracle cure for all ailments, apparently, including PCOS. So we're going to talk through each of these with Candice, who is our resident PCOS dietitian. So Candice, tell us a bit about some of the challenges people face when it comes to nutrition and PCOS that kind of leads them to ask this question.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, we often get asked here, what is the best diet for X, Y, or Z condition? Obviously, today we're focusing on PCOS. And I think the big issue isn't a simple answer to that question overall. As dietitians, we will, tend to follow what the science and the evidence tells us about what is the best diet. But, quite often this research is lagging a little bit behind what the trends are and what social media is pushing and what the latest influencer might be recommending from a diet perspective. So, what we need to look at is what's going to work for each individual and choose the best option for them. And I guess also what we know is that, there's lots of diets and meal plans out there. We often don't prescribe diets and meal plans with our clients because they're just not sustainable in the long term. And, you might, go really well on a meal plan or a certain kind of diet in the short term. And that's usually when your motivation is quite high. But, we often can't stick to these diets in the long term. And so we need things that are going to be sustainable, that are going to fit into your lifestyle as well. When we have rigid food rules, it can limit our ability to socialize, to enjoy life. We get a little bit of resentment towards certain diets when we're out and about and we feel like we can't have something and we're missing out. And then if you stray from your diet, we have the whole issue that you start to feel guilty and you're not pleased with yourself that maybe you've lacked the willpower to stick with something. So, it's important that we look at things like your work schedules, whether you're going to be traveling. What are you cooking for your other family members? No one has time to cook multiple meals as well. So, we want things that are going to fit in with your life. And I think that's really important that we consider. And I guess another thing that we'll highlight when we're looking at some of these diets today is that, the diet cycle can often lead to quite disordered eating patterns. And I think it's really important that we're encouraging people to eat in a way that is sustainable so that we're avoiding some of those disordered eating. And we know that, women with PCOS are more likely to present with not necessarily eating disorders, certainly that some of them do present with eating disordered, but just that disordered eating pattern where we can no longer kind of tell when we're hungry or tell when we've had enough to eat naturally. And I think that's a skill that we're born with. And unfortunately, we quite often override those signals and we're no longer in touch with them. So I think it's important that we teach people sort of how to work those things out, overall. And I guess with PCOS, we know that your hunger and fullness cues can be a little bit out of whack because of the hormone imbalances that are present. So it's quite complex to find the right thing for each individual person. But I guess the point is that the best diet is the one that you can stick to, that fits in with your lifestyle. And, it's going to be, the right pieces of the puzzle of your eating strategies and those dietary patterns that are going to suit your particular goals, your lifestyle, and those types of things. So we can have a look at what some of those diet trends are for PCOS and look at some of those core principles of those diets and why they might be beneficial, and have a look, I think, at the pros and cons of each of those as well. So I think the first one we're going to look at today is probably my least favorite, and that would be the keto diet. So if we think about the keto diet, there's lots of different variations of keto diets out there, but generally speaking, what we are looking at is a diet that is very low in carbohydrates. So usually we're talking about a diet that is less than 20 grams of carbs. And usually this also comes with the diet being higher in fats as well. And this might not necessarily be the good kind of healthy fat that we are interested in. And I guess in this category too, we'll also include other very low carb diets. So these are diets where the carbohydrates are usually about 50 grams or less. Okay, so they're pretty low. And I guess the reason that low-carb diets have been promoted with PCOS is because of the underlying insulin resistance that usually occurs with PCOS. So we've certainly talked about insulin resistance in some previous podcasts, so you can jump in and have a listen to some of those. But the insulin resistance, if we improve insulin resistance, it is going to improve your PCOS-related symptoms. And so when you're following a lower carb or a keto diet, you are certainly going to get some benefits in that area. But I think one of the downsides of this is that there is a lack of whole grains in this diet. And this means that your diet is probably going to be quite low in fiber, and it's very hard to get adequate fiber intake from things like just eating vegetables. For example, we certainly are going to be promoting a high intake of vegetables, but we're just not going to be getting enough of those, those insoluble fibers in particular when we're not including any whole grains in the diet. So I think another side of it is also, if we're not eating enough fiber in the diet, we are going to have some potential issues with the gut microbiome. So we've certainly highlighted a little bit about the gut microbiome across our time here on the podcast, but we're learning a lot more about it. And we know that women with PCOS do have an altered gut microbiome, but we don't know sort of whether the PCOS is causing that or whether the PCOS is causing the altered gut microbiome, or the altered gut microbiome is contributing to the PCOS itself. But regardless of that, things like whole grains and fruits are really essential to getting your gut enough fiber to promote the growth of a healthy gut microbiome. So we want to make sure that we are including some of these whole grains in the diet. And I think a lot of our population group are also obviously, females who are trying to conceive. And we certainly do recommend whole grains as a really important part of your diet if you are preparing to try to conceive or thinking about it in the future too. So I guess that's sort of the main reasons why we don't generally recommend these very low carb diets. But another thing is that they're also just not very sustainable. If you have a look at our food supply, pretty much majority of our style of eating does contain a good amount of carbohydrate food. So it can be really challenging to not be eating those carbohydrates. So if your food choices are limited, then it can lead to a lower calorie intake as well. And we know that if we're under eating for a period of time, we can develop something called hypothalamic amenorrhea. And sometimes this can be a little bit confusing with PCOS symptoms as well. So it is important that we make sure that we're eating adequately to support sort of that healthy reproductive system as well. And we never really recommend diets that are highly restrictive just because of the nature of it can lead to some of that disordered eating as well. So overall, yes, the keto diet will improve some PCOS symptoms, but it's really not sustainable in the long term. And it also has the downside of being low in fiber, and it is generally quite high in those unhealthy fats as well. And so that can lead to other potential health consequences down the track too. So the next diet we'll have a look at is intermittent fasting. Now, this has been really popular over the years. There are a variety of protocols when it comes to intermittent fasting. And so the protocol that we're going to look at today is the 16 and 8 intermittent fasting protocol. So this is where you fast for 16 hours of the day, and then you will eat in an 8-hour window of the day. So if we look at, generally speaking, what most people will do is they might start eating at 11 a.m. or 12 p.m. So you skip breakfast basically. And then you'd finish eating at 7 or 8 p.m. at night. That's sort of the most typical protocol, but it can be sort of any window that you like. The other variations could be different time frames with that fasting. So it might be, 18 hours of fasting, 6 hours of eating. The other protocols with that are the 5 and 2, which is where you eat normally for 5 days and then you're on a calorie restriction for 2 days, which is like 500 calories a day, that type of thing. Now, I guess intermittent fasting has been touted to have lots of hormonal benefits, and we certainly do know that there is some benefit on fasting with that insulin resistance. So that is generally a very positive thing. But the issue can be that because we have a small eating window, we might be actually eating really or larger portions than are ideal for us when we are eating a meal. So it is important, if we're looking at intermittent fasting, that we are not eating sort of big meals in that window that we're eating in as well. So we still need to pull out sort of the important foundations that we'll talk about that are going to be around our portioning of our foods and getting balance in our meals as well. The other issue, I guess, is that the intermittent fasting isn't recommended if you're trying to conceive. And so that sort of takes out a lot of our population. I don't recommend it very often, but there are occasions where I do have some of my clients doing a version of intermittent fasting where it's appropriate. But I think it's really something that you need to be assessed for before you were to start a diet like this. Again, having that kind of highly restrictive nature can lead to some of those disordered eating patterns that we've highlighted as well. So we certainly want to make sure we're not exacerbating anything in the disordered eating area as well. So certainly intermittent fasting can have some potential benefits, but it does have some downsides as well. So it's something that we need to consider in the overall picture too. I guess another diet that Steph mentioned at the start is our dairy-free and gluten-free diet too. And so I guess there are lots of social media accounts that do promote the gluten-free, dairy-free diet for PCOS. I guess this one, we don't have a lot of evidence to say that, yes, it does help. Anecdotally, some people would find that it does help. But again, unless you have been diagnosed with celiac disease, it is very unlikely that you actually need to follow a gluten-free diet. Sometimes the issue is more so that we have, perhaps we have some food intolerances, and so we might be looking at, some things like FODMAPs can be potentially an issue there. So I think it's certainly worthwhile thinking about sort of all those different elements. And so we, generally speaking, wouldn't recommend a gluten-free, dairy-free diet unless you had specific intolerances that we were to investigate and identify. So it's one that, we won't usually be recommending that unless it's indicated on an individual level. And that's part of what we would assess with you in our role as dietitians too. Another diet that's probably a little bit more old school and has been very popularly prescribed for PCOS is the low GI diet. So basically, a low GI diet means that the carbohydrate foods that we are eating, they will break down slower in your digestive system. And so when we eat carbohydrate foods, they break down, they turn into glucose, they're absorbed into your bloodstream. And as your blood glucose levels go up, your body produces an insulin response. And insulin's job is to help move your glucose out of your bloodstream and into your cells, so into places like your muscles. So when we eat bigger portions of carbohydrate food, we will get a bigger insulin response. When we eat what we call high GI carbohydrate foods, the carbohydrates break down very quickly and the glucose will enter our blood very quickly. And this can produce a higher insulin response as well. So when we talk about insulin resistance being one of the underlying issues for PCOS, we are thinking about, whether we need to manage how our body is releasing insulin to help manage that resistance. So if we're choosing more low GI foods, which they will help to produce a lower insulin response. So that's basically where the low GI diet comes into play. So there is some really great evidence, and we do have lots of really good research around the low GI diet, and there are many aspects of this diet that I will use with a lot of my clients. So choosing lower GI foods will help to keep you fuller for longer. It does allow you to include things like whole grains, fruits, and dairy foods and even things like legumes, which are more restricted in lower carb eating patterns. And we get so many sort of vitamins, minerals, fiber, from those foods that are really essential for our overall health, not just for our PCOS management. So I think it's really beneficial to make sure we're eating enough of those core foods in our diets as well. I guess the only issue I find with the low GI diet is that the low GI perspective of it per se doesn't take into account what we call the glycemic load. And the glycemic load is really more important than the glycemic index or the GI when we're talking about PCOS management. So what the glycemic load takes into account is the GI of the food as well as portion or the amount of that food that you're actually eating. And so when we combine the GI and the portion of that food, it gives us a much clearer idea of what the insulin response will be. So, for example, if you're eating a low GI food, but you're eating bucket loads of it, so you might be eating a nice, dense low GI bread, but you've eaten 6 slices of it, that's still going to produce a large insulin response because of the carbohydrate volume that's coming in. If you're eating a higher GI food, but you're only eating a little bit of it, so let's say you're eating, a couple of squares of chocolate, for example, that's not going to have a big insulin response because it's got a very small carbohydrate volume in total. So if we're eating low GI foods in the right amounts, this is what's going to produce sort of the most optimal insulin response in the body. And this is what we're looking at for managing the symptoms of PCOS and the underlying insulin resistance that goes with it. So that's certainly what a lot of the work we do with our clients is looking at their carbohydrate foods, helping them to choose the better types of carbohydrate foods and helping them to choose the right amount for them. And I guess that's sort of the really important distinction is that the amount of carbohydrate each individual needs is very different. And so if we're looking at how much you need, we need to take into account your body size, your activity levels, your general sort of day-to-day movement patterns, any exercise you're doing, and all of these factors determine how much fuel your body burns each day and then how much carbohydrate we would estimate that you need. So I think that side of things is really individual, and it's really important that you're getting the right advice for you. So we don't have a set number of carbs that we're necessarily recommending for each person each day, but we have sort of a broad range that we'd be prescribing you, and we would see how your body responds to that. And then from there, we would have the ability to, take your carbs up or down based on how your body is responding to a certain amount of carbohydrate. So I think that's probably one of the diets that we take a lot of our principles from. We don't follow a low GI diet program per se, but we're using a lot of those principles with our clients. Another diet that has been hugely popular is the Mediterranean diet. And we've talked about the Mediterranean diet in the context of lots of things before. And I guess what we know is that the diet is very much, it's claimed to be the healthiest diet in the world, basically. And there's really good reason for that. It's characterized by eating lots of plant-based foods, so lots of vegetables, fruits, whole grains. It's very low in saturated fats, so we eat things like fish, not too much meat. There's not a lot of sort of highly processed foods in there. There's lots of extra virgin olive oil as the main fat source. And there's not really many downsides to the Mediterranean diet. And so this is why it does have so many benefits. And I guess we've talked a lot in the past about how we use Mediterranean diets in our practice. We don't follow a Mediterranean diet per se, but we will certainly, take aspects of the Mediterranean diet into our practice. So probably one of the biggest benefits of the Mediterranean diet is the anti-inflammatory side of things. And so the diet is very rich in these antioxidants from those fruits and veggies and omega-3s and extra virgin olive oil. And we know that with PCOS, you do have this underlying low-grade inflammation that, that sits underneath all of it. And that inflammation, it might not be causing you, problems per se, but it's there and it is contributing, in the long term to your overall health. So if we can, take the anti-inflammatory principles and put them into your diet as well, it's certainly something we do work a lot with all of our clients, just because of the general health benefits. So Mediterranean diet's a fabulous diet. It certainly, is indicated for use with PCOS. But again, what we probably do here is look at modified versions of the Mediterranean diet, and we put that into, what you're going to be doing with your diet. So, the scientific community hasn't quite agreed yet on what the very best diet for PCOS is. And I think, the reason for that is because what works for one person doesn't necessarily work for another. And so there is no one best diet overall, but we can take the principles of lots of these diets and put them into practice in a way that, as we said at the start, suits your lifestyle, your work, your family. So it's important that we customize something that fits in with you. So the things that we'll generally consider is, are we managing insulin resistance with PCOS? Because if we are, then our top priority is looking at things like your carbohydrate, choosing those lower GI carbohydrates, getting those carbohydrate portions in the right amount. And when we're looking at our carbohydrate foods, we don't just eat carbs in the diet, so we've got to look at the other things as well. So are we eating protein with our carbohydrate foods? Are we getting enough protein in our diet day to day? And again, the amount of protein each person needs is very individual. So it's thinking about, well, are you getting the right amount of protein for you? Are we choosing the best protein types? So proteins that are low in saturated fats, proteins, so it's looking at things like, fish and eggs. And if you're trying to conceive, there's other things that will come into play with that as well. We'll also look at managing that underlying inflammation. So, we'll put anti-inflammatory principles into that diet too. So when we're looking at your carbohydrate food types, we're making sure you're getting enough fruit in the diet. We're making sure you're getting enough veggies, that you're eating lots of different colors with those vegetables, that you're using lots of healthy fats. So things like that extra virgin olive oil, are you having nuts and seeds? Are you having your oily fish? Are you using herbs and spices in your cooking for your flavorings and those types of things? So looking at getting the right amount of these things in your diet every day and every week is really one of the best things that we can be doing. We also want to have a look at whether we're considering weight management for some people. And we tend not to have a weight-focused approach in how we practice, because sometimes what happens with your weight is just going to be an outcome of the behaviours and the habits that we're implementing. But some of our clients, their weight is something that's really important to them. So we will work with that if that's an important goal for you as well. And then, we want to look at putting that all together. So how do we piece that together with the timing of your meals, the timing of your snacks if you're going to be having them, and sort of putting that whole dietary plan into place with you. So the best diet for PCOS is the one that has the right principles that deal with the underlying issues that you're experiencing. So managing your PCOS symptoms, and they can be quite variable from person to person as well. But the best diet is one that's individualized to you, and it fits in with your family, your work, your social life, and it's sustainable in the long term. And I think the sustainability is the most important part that we need to consider overall, because if we can't stick with something, then it's not going to work in the long term. And when we're looking at things like PCOS, these are not just short-term conditions that go away. They're conditions that can be managed, but if we can't stick and adhere to what we're doing in the long term, then that's where we're going to have some trouble with managing things overall. So
Mm.
hopefully that puts it into a little bit of perspective. We don't have a simple answer there, I guess, but we're taking aspects of our low GI diets, of our Mediterranean diets in particular, to help manage your PCOS symptoms the very best we can, and customizing those for you individually.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that last point, you really took the words out of my mouth, was that PCOS is a chronic condition, and it's also a chronic condition that increases your risk of certain other conditions like type 2 diabetes, gestational diabetes, if you choose to get pregnant one day, all of that kind of stuff. And so you have to come at it with an approach of, what am I going to be able to do for years and years? Not, what can I do for the next 4 weeks, 6 weeks? I'll just, fast for the next 8 weeks, and I'll lose a few kilos, and then I'll just go back to the way that I was eating before. You just can't take that kind of approach when we're talking about chronic conditions. And in my opinion, shouldn't take that approach for anything anyway, because hopefully you're going to have a long, healthy life. So we don't want to have these short-term fixes. So I think having that sustainability factor in mind is so, so key, and focusing on dietary inclusions rather than exclusions, which typically is the characteristic of diets like keto or low carb or intermittent fasting or gluten-free, dairy-free. I mean, it's even in the name, what you can't eat, right? So it seems so much less sexy to talk about low GI and Mediterranean, but these are the things that genuinely have significant evidence that they're helpful, and they're also the things that people are going to stick to in the long term, which is ultimately going to lead to better outcomes for your PCOS and your relevant goals. So thank you, Candice, for providing such a comprehensive summary on some of the key dietary patterns we see people talk about when it comes to PCOS, and your insights on some of your favorites. Tailoring is absolutely key. Each person with PCOS comes with their own unique set of symptoms and, of course, goals. So it's super important that you invest in seeing a dietitian for your PCOS, ideally soon after you're diagnosed. But if you were diagnosed, 10, 20 years ago, people come and see us then and they just go, wow, I wish I knew all this stuff. I wish I knew all this stuff 10, 20 years ago. So don't delay. This is your health after all, and your future health. So please make sure that you connect with us. There is a link in the show notes, as always, for you to make an inquiry about our virtual clinic, see Candice for yourself, and pick her incredible brain with almost 15 years experience in this field about PCOS, and receive your own customized nutrition plan. So thank you, Candice, for joining us on the pod today. Thanks so much to Candice for joining us for this PCOS mini-series episode of Fertility Friendly Food. I hope you got a lot out of this episode and are hopefully giving some of those not so great or sustainable dietary patterns a bit of a flick, and instead tuning more into a customized approach that is founded on evidence-based principles such as the low GI and Mediterranean dietary principles. If you are looking for one-on-one support for your PCOS management, then we here at the Dietologist offer a fully virtual service wherever you are in the world to support you on your path to PCOS management. We would love to hear from you. The link is in our show notes to drop us an inquiry and get started on your PCOS management path. We are so excited to be partnering with you on your health journey. Now, don't forget to subscribe or follow on whatever podcast platform you're listening to right now. Hit the rating and review button. Leave us those 5 stars. That really does go a long way in helping us reach more ears, and share it with a fellow PCOS sister. And I will catch you in the next episode, everyone. Bye. Just quickly, are you currently trying to conceive, or are you on a fertility journey? If so, you can feel like there are 101 things you could or should be doing when it comes to your preconception or fertility health. It's easy to get overwhelmed really quickly. This is exactly why we created our preconception lifestyle checklist. It's one page for you and one page for your partner, categorized into supplements, diet, lifestyle, and environmental factors, and we focus on the low-hanging fruit. These are simple but effective strategies known to help improve your health and well-being for fertility and also for a healthy pregnancy and a healthy baby too. Over 5,000 people have downloaded it already. Do you want your free copy too? Head to the link in the show notes now to swipe your free checklist. Okay, let's get into today's episode. Fertility Friendly Food, the podcast, acknowledges the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognises the continuing connections to lands, waters, and community. We pay our respects to First Nation cultures and to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all First Nations people tuning in today. This podcast is recorded on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation.